Morning, 2 days before Christmas, 1814. A lone figure darts through the tangled swamps and bayous toward the city of New Orleans. The man is a Creole, commanding a party of American militia stationed at his home, the Villaire Plantation, a mere 10 miles from the crowded downtown streets. He has escaped capture earlier in the day to bring a desperate message to the commander of the American Army, the man charged with keeping the country's key port safe from the British. It is here, at the gateway to the Mississippi, the lifeline for American goods and weapons, that this officer arrived a month before, so gaunt and wasted by dysentery and the travails of frontier battle that his appearance in Louisiana drew murmurs from the local crowds. This is the man who will save New Orleans? The Creole gasps out the electrifying news. The enemy, an advance guard of some 1,800 British soldiers, is not merely on the march. They are already here and have captured the Villaire Plantation itself. Now it falls to a rough 47-year-old Major General who is experienced primarily in fighting Indians and Spaniards to drive back the greatest army in the world. The troops that vanquished Napoleon just a few months before. The King's 4th Regiment of war-hardened veterans. The 85th Light Infantry. The Crack Rifle Regiment of the 95th, tempered on the battlefields of Spain and Portugal, and the 93rd Highlanders, fresh from garrison duty in South Africa. But to the man called Hawkface and Old Hickory by his soldiers, this is what he has been waiting for. And the thought of impending battle is welcome. Few Americans alive hate the British as much as Andrew Jackson. After 2 years of fighting, the War of 1812 is in its last throes. Even now, negotiations are underway in Ghent, Belgium for a peace accord. But one last battle remains, here at the linchpin port of America, New Orleans.
It's not as if this attack on New Orleans is coming right out of the blue. Britain's been thinking about this for a long while. It's a great artery from the central heartland of America that can bring things out into the Gulf of Mexico, and of course from there can go out to the Sugar Islands, various places that are controlled by Britain. So for 60 years, this idea has been bubbling about, and now the British were going to do it.
For Jackson, the questions have only been where and when the British will appear. Now he knows. He decides to attack that very night.
By the Eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil. I will smash them, so help me God.
Jackson orders the USS Carolina, a 230-ton schooner with 14 mounted guns, to move down the Mississippi south of the British encampment. At 5 p.m., as darkness descends, Jackson's troops pour silently out of the city and take up positions on a plantation just north of the British.
The British Army is so sure that nothing is going to happen. Of course, they do have their pickets out, but they decide to cook dinner and to build fires because the men are wet and they're cold. They are not expecting the American Army to come down where they are, and they warm themselves, and of course the light of the fires now illuminate their camps. It gives the Carolina an excellent shot.
When the ship, the Carolina, began to close, the sentries there of the Rifle Brigade thought that this was a British supply ship. They look at it, they see it getting closer, and all of a sudden the guns open up. The thing, though, is where's this attack coming from? Because now that they've started to move, they find that there's some firing coming from the land side.
Jackson has sprung the trap, attacking the British from two sides. By the time the British regroup, the Americans are upon them. One British officer describes the scene.
Each officer, as he succeeded in collecting 20 or 30 men about him, plunged into the midst of the enemy's ranks, where it was fought hand to hand, bayonet to bayonet, saber to saber.
In the darkness, the two sides become hopelessly intermingled.
It was very difficult to see anything. So the two sides were wondering, what you might almost say blundering about, in the dark, trying to find one another and hoping that they weren't shooting at their own side. The Americans bring forward a cannon. The British almost capture it. Somebody, an officer, comes up and manages to save the cannon with some people with him and is almost captured. The British don't know it, but they've almost, at that point, captured Andrew Jackson.
With British reinforcements arriving, Jackson orders his men to fall back. The brief encounter makes a lasting impression on both sides.
It's more of a skirmish by European standards, but it's made the British think. And it's made the American troops think that maybe they've got a chance against the British.
What neither side realizes is that the battle they have just fought will be the last official battle of the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent, ending all hostilities between Great Britain and the United States, is signed at a Belgian monastery at 6 p.m. December 24, 1814. But in New Orleans, the conflict is just beginning. The conflict that will coalesce and define a fledgling nation, transforming both the men who have come to do battle and the nation for which they fight. In the 2 bloody years since war against Britain was declared, the War of 1812 has proved arduous for the Americans. Along the eastern seaboard, ocean-going British troops have raided towns with impunity. In the summer of 1814, they briefly capture Washington, D.C., burning the public buildings of the capital and nearly capturing President James Madison. The causes of the war are many. The British are accused of inciting the Indians against American settlers on the frontier, and seizing American ships and conscripting American sailors into the British Navy. As England is entangled with Napoleon, America has turned a covetous eye to the British territories in Canada. Britain hopes to withhold the Indian land as a buffer zone between its former colonies and their Canadian holdings. But to many, the War of 1812 seems to test the American Revolution. Only if the upstart republic can organize and fight can it hope to retain the hard-won rights and territories stipulated in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Of these territories, few are as vital as New Orleans. Once held by the Spanish and the French, now in the possession of a young nation. Almost 40% of the produce and goods of the young republic flow down the Mississippi River through what has been dubbed the Crescent City.
Everything from west of the Alleghenies to the southern plains of Canada to the Great Plains themselves had to move down the Mississippi River and past the port of New Orleans. So whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the interior of the continent.
As Thomas Jefferson observed, America now has an Achilles heel.
There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is the natural enemy of the United States. It is New Orleans.
If Great Britain had been able to gain access and capture New Orleans, they could have used it as a stranglehold for the development of the United States. They very easily could have choked off all trade from the interior of the continent.
And now, in December of 1814, a British fleet of almost 15,000 veteran troops and 50 ships, fresh from their victories against Napoleon, converges on this vulnerable spot. And now, in December of 1814, a British fleet of almost 15,000 veteran troops and 50 ships, fresh from their victories against Napoleon, converges on this vulnerable spot. At the helm is Admiral Alexander Cochrane, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the North American Station. He is a seasoned professional, a consummate bureaucrat with a distaste for all things American. He expresses an ardor for the coming attack.
It will be to my great satisfaction to give them a complete drubbing before peace is made, and see the command of the Mississippi wrested from them.
If the British capture New Orleans, they can use it as a bargaining chip to force American concessions. For the commander of the American forces at New Orleans, the possibility is unthinkable. It is the Revolutionary War that left 13-year-old Andrew Jackson an orphan, and he still bears scars on his face and hand said to have come from an English officer who tried to force the young rebel to shine his boots. As Jackson grows up, he becomes known for his quick temper, his readiness to duel and brawl. He takes offense from no man. Now with the British once again on his doorstep, Jackson is quick to enter the fray.
The amazing thing with Jackson is that he reacts immediately. He's an aggressive individual, and he decides that he will go out and meet the enemy on his own terms and attempt to defeat him.
Jackson's daring night attack gives the British pause, but the odds are still very much in their favor. When Napoleon Bonaparte abdicates his throne in early 1814, the British are able to throw almost 20,000 veteran troops into the fighting in North America.
The British Army is the most skillful, the best equipped, and the most successful army the world has ever seen. This is an army that has defeated Napoleon, and his troops have been outmanned and outgeneraled by the British Army and its officers.
Britain has at its disposal the best and most experienced combat officers in the world. By contrast, the American Army is a diverse, if not motley, group.
Throughout history, we've always come to believe that the Americans at New Orleans are a bunch of coonskin-wearing riflemen. New Orleans is perhaps the greatest conglomeration of individuals in American history.
It consists of French and Spanish-speaking militias. It consists of militias from Tennessee, Kentucky, from Mississippi. It consists of free men of color. It consists of Native Americans. It also included regulars from the United States Army, the Marines, and seamen of the United States Navy. This was one of the most diverse forces, if not the most diverse force ever brought together to protect and fight for the United States.
The Creoles of New Orleans muster up 5 companies of men from some of the finest families in the city. They are to stand side by side with ragged and near-destitute frontiersmen.
There were a couple of thousand Kentucky militiamen that had come down to join Jackson. Most of them arrived in rags, and they were weaponless, not a single firearm among most of them. They had to scrounge the city to find anything to give them, and only about 500 of these men got these weapons. The rest of them were used in a reserve line and given farm tools and clubs. In case the British broke through, they would be a last-ditch effort to fight back.
Jackson does not let any personal biases stand in the way of taking volunteers from the New Orleans populace. Though a slaveholder himself, Jackson willingly adds 500 free men of color to his ranks. He even demands that they be paid the same compensation as their white counterparts, $124 and 160 acres of land. The notorious Indian fighter also convinces the local Choctaw leader to organize a group of his warriors into a company. And portions of the 7th U.S. Infantry and 44th U.S. Infantry are here as well.
The individuals who are in the regular service, who are there because it's their job, they have to be, they are the instruments of government policy.
There is one more group from Louisiana which will play a part in the coming battle. They're a rough and lawless group of smugglers and privateers known as the Barratarians. No one, American or British, is quite sure whose side they will take. Late December 1814. The unseasonably warm winter weather is finally turning chill. In Belgium, American and British negotiators have agreed on a treaty. But that word has not reached Washington, let alone New Orleans. Here the streets are deserted. The entire city has mobilized to block an impending British invasion of this key port. They come together in a force as diverse as the city itself. Army regulars, free blacks, Creoles, and the ragged frontiersmen they call dirty shirts. But there is one wild card among them yet to be played. They are called Baratarians, named for Baratarian Bay where they are thought to congregate. These are the smugglers who haunt the swamps and back streets of New Orleans. Their nominal leader is a French refugee from Santo Domingo named Jean Lafitte.
Lafitte is an amazing character. He's arrived from nowhere and taken over the underworld of New Orleans. He's become socially acceptable in certain circles because he can supply what the New Orleanians want. But let's not be mistaken about Lafitte. Lafitte is a pirate, and that entails being a murderer.
But Lafitte has resources that far outweigh his unsavory reputation, a vast stock of powder and shot, the very thing that Jackson needs, and control of Grande Terre, which offers the perfect location to oversee all backwater approaches to New Orleans. After entertaining overtures from both Great Britain and America to join the fray, Lafitte decides to side with the Americans. Perhaps he feels they are less likely to interfere in his primary livelihood, the plundering of Spanish ships. But even as the Americans consolidate their disparate troops, just a few miles away at the Villers plantation, the British are welcoming their own reinforcements. On Christmas Day, British Commander Major General Sir Edward Michael Pakenham, the Duke of Wellington's own brother-in-law, has arrived to take command.
He's a young man, 38, but he's spent all of his life in the army. He can see that maybe it was all leading up to this battle that he's about to fight in the Americas. He got into the Peninsular War. He was fighting under Wellington. Wellington made him his adjutant general. Then at the Battle of Salamanca, it was Pakenham who led the attack. Even Wellington said of him, "My partiality for him, nevertheless, does not lead me astray when I say he is one of the best that we have."
Soon, Pakenham will have 10,000 troops at his immediate disposal, with several thousand in reserve and large numbers of sailors and marines waiting aboard the British ships 50 miles distant. But the British fleet has to anchor far from landfall, due to the shallow waters around New Orleans. Their troops and supplies must be rowed some 68 miles to a landing spot, only to face a hard slog through heavy mud. And once on land, the artillery is almost impossible to move.
The British Army, for example, has to muscle everything, 60 miles in open boats, through swamps, through mud. It is a back-breaking and amazing physical achievement what they do.
This is a floodplain, so close to the water table, the ground is sodden. So when the cannon finally come, they have to come over this very same ground. It's not impossible to move the cannon in, but it's almost impossible. The heaviest artillery, in fact, are on naval carriages with short wheels, very small wheels that pick up even more mud and have to be almost dragged as if they were on sleds through this great thick mud.
Jackson has made sure that his army has the best position on the battlefield and has flooded the plain in front of his ramparts. His well-constructed earth and wooden breastworks run almost a mile from the Mississippi River to the wooded swamp.
Jackson has chosen the ideal location. We have the river to one side, we have a cypress swamp to our rear. We can build these parapets in such a way that the men can be protected against an assault by bayonets. We can step forward and have a rolling fire of continual musketry and rifle fire. We will bring them into a funnel.
Though only a few miles of swampland separates the Americans from the British troops, there has been scant contact between the two armies. There is a lone exception.
The Americans are using somewhat unorthodox techniques by European standards of sending out American Indians, primarily Choctaws, and hunting parties of militia to render their pickets useless.
Well, of course, anybody sneaking up on one of your men at night and scalping him or slitting his throat is going to put bad thoughts in your head, no matter what experiences you may have had before.
One British officer decries this demoralizing practice.
Those savages have no knowledge of how war should be fought. In Europe, when two armies face each other, the outposts of neither are molested. These dirty shirts entertain no such chivalric notions.
The frigid weather also begins to take its toll on the British troops.
The winter is one of the worst in history for New Orleans. It's freezing cold, there is sleet and rain. One of the main problems, the two West Indies regiments, these were black troops from the West Indies fighting in the British Army. They had never experienced cold weather, were not acclimated, and were not really equipped, and many of them just simply died from exposure.
On December 28th, General Pakenham has had enough. He decides to break the uneasy standoff with a test of the American forces he terms a reconnaissance in force. This will help him pinpoint any weaknesses in Jackson's line and better plan his attack. There is a sudden roar as the British cannons come to life. The American artillery responds in kind.
The major difference between the American and British artillery is that the Americans had cotton bales available to them, and they were able to entrench their cannon positions by using these cotton bales as a base to absorb the high groundwater.
The British are having major problems trying to keep their artillery from sinking into the mud and being able to serve them.
One British lieutenant describes the impact of the American fire.
The Americans are excellent shots, as well with artillery as rifles. A tremendous cannonade mowed down our ranks and deafened us with its roar.
Colonel Robert Rennie and elements of the 21st Foot make an aggressive attack on Jackson's left flank. A few of the American riflemen in the woods are overconfident and are felled by British muskets. The American line begins to crumble. Rennie's men now have an opportunity to penetrate the American battle line. But just as victory seems in sight, Colonel Rennie receives the order to retreat. Pakenham's reconnaissance is over. The next day, unaware that peace has been declared a week before, General Pakenham decides he has no choice but to stage a frontal attack. His troops prepare scaling ladders and bundles of cane that will be thrown into the deep ditch in front of the American breastworks so it can be crossed.
General Pakenham's plan is sound. All the general did was use a tried and true formula, basically forming his men into columns of companies as a giant battering ram, where he could move a large mass of men forward and then deploy and take the works.
The British had been attacking and capturing fortified positions against Napoleon for years. These fortifications were 10 times more massive than Jackson's relatively puny little wall of mud. There was nothing to it. His plan was based on written-out military books that had analyzed such situations before. It was by the book.
It basically involved seizing the American position on the west bank of the Mississippi River, capturing the American artillery on that side of the river, and before dawn, his main force sweeping up the east bank of the Mississippi River over top of Jackson's entrenchments with the captured American artillery on the west bank, pounding the Americans at the same time.
If everything goes to plan, he should have 2 columns of attack piling into the American line at the same time. Jackson will not have 1 attack to deal with, but 2. He must weaken his line somewhere, and Pakenham will go for that weakness.
The odds seem skewed toward the British. In the early dawn of January 8th, almost 10,000 seasoned British troops will attack a ragtag militia only half their size. But what the British can't know is that nothing on that frigid January morning will go as planned. As dawn breaks on January 8, 1815, the cold New Orleans swamps come alive. The British Army, led by General Edward Pakenham, is preparing for a full frontal attack. Their target, the well-entrenched American troops of Major General Andrew Jackson. The British await the first shots.
The British have become very impatient. One of the reasons they decide to go on the 8th is based on the fact of British morale being seen to start to drop a little, or even a lot. The men have had several aborted attempts at the wall and been called back. They've been enduring this cold weather, living out in the open, enduring harassing artillery fire constantly. So they're ready to go. They want to get in there, in this thing, take the position, be victorious as they always have been, and get it over with.
The main British attack will be by a column of companies. Major General Samuel Gibbs, a veteran of action from South Africa to Canada to Gibraltar, will make the main attack on Jackson's left with 2,500 men. A much smaller force will attempt to flank Jackson's riflemen in the wooded swamp, while other troops hit Jackson's right. Reinforcements are set to hit the center of the fray, while a detachment of British troops will cross the Mississippi River, attacking the less well-defended American entrenchments there. Their plan, to block the artillery from firing on the British, and then to capture the guns and turn them on Jackson's own flank. One regiment, the 44th Foot, is assigned as an advance force which will deliver the ladders and cane bundles to the front, allowing the advance lines to breach the ditch and scale the breastworks that protect Jackson's troops. Andrew Jackson has some 3,800 fighting men on the line behind his stout breastworks, 4 men deep in most spots. There are now 9 well-serviced artillery positions and 1,200 men held in reserve. A blanket of early morning fog carpets the battlefield.
In the American lines, they know an attack is imminent. The one thing that is very important in the American lines is morale. They believe they have beaten the British twice.
The Americans are ready. The morale is good. They've learned they can depend on each other. They fought together for the past 2 weeks.
But the size of the opposing force is daunting. One Kentucky militiaman later claims to have seen the wings of the Angel of Death in the clouds above Chalmette that day.
Shoulder, fire line. Prime and load.
At last, General Pakenham orders the advance. Jackson's artillery responds. Over the breastworks comes the sound of English drums, fifes, and bagpipes. In response, the band of the Creole Bataillon d'Orléans strikes up the tune Yankee Doodle and the French Marseillaise. But now Pakenham's plan begins to unravel. The troops sent to attack the American West Bank become mired in mud. They are struggling to reach the opposite bank of the river. As the fog begins to lift, the first British column appears. The battle-hardened Colonel Rennie and his light infantry bear down on a small American redoubt of Jackson's line and overrun it.
They attacked. They got in. They actually got the majority of their men inside there. Most of his men were either killed or captured. Very few that got inside the American works were able to get away.
Meanwhile, the scaling ladders and cane bundles necessary for the main force to bridge Jackson's line have been left behind in the confusion, thanks to a nervous and inattentive colonel. The main column begins to falter.
And instead of an attack that's pouring over the American breastworks, there's a mass of humanity that comes to a grinding halt in front of it, and in front of the cannon, and in front of muskets and rifles. All they had to do was get in behind the line Jackson. But it wasn't going to happen.
The British main column is now in range of American rifles and muskets. Jackson gives the order.
They are near enough now, gentlemen. You may fire when ready.
The whole of the American battle line explodes into a wall of flame and lead, as described by one of the surviving British officers.
The enemy no sooner got us within 150 yards of their works than a most destructive and murderous fire was opened on our column of round, grape, musketry, rifle and buckshot along the course and length of our line in front, as well as on our left flank.
Another British officer recounts the fate of the 44th Regiment. Literally swept from the face of the earth in less time than one can write it.
The ground was so wet and the groundwater so high that the few fortifications they could throw up were so weak and so small that the American artillery on their more firmer entrenchments were able to pound it to pieces.
The stalwart Highlanders are ordered to march diagonally, right in front of the American line of fire, and they obey unflinchingly.
They had missed a lot of the carnage and a lot of the activity in the Napoleonic Wars, but it gave them a certain discipline and conduct that a lot of the others didn't have. The last word was to halt, so that's what they did. They stood there. One American observer described them as immovable and solid as a brick wall. He was moved to tears watching row after row of gallant Highlander mown down.
Many of the senior British officers are now wounded or dead. General Pakenham himself rides to the front to rally his troops. Suddenly, his horse is raked with grape shot. As he tries to remount another horse, he is shot a second time. He will die almost instantly. The second in command, General Gibbs, is also fatally wounded. General John Lambert, one of the few surviving officers, surveys the carnage in front of him and orders a retreat.
Unlike the popular song of recent days, the British did not exactly turn around and run away. They fought right at that rampart until they could fight no more. They then withdrew.
Across the river, the small British force makes the ill-equipped and poorly led Americans there flee. It is too small and too late an advantage to be exploited by the British.
They look over at the East Bank and they see that it's all over. Doesn't matter how quick they've been, the battle on the East Bank was quicker.
But on the main battlefield, the British Army has suffered an unexpected and devastating defeat.
The American casualties on the east bank of the Mississippi during the Battle of Chalmette are almost very small. They're only 13. Six men are killed, 7 are wounded. In comparison, the British lose over 2,000 men, almost a third of their attacking force, in probably less than 20 minutes of heavy fighting.
Among the British dead are 2 major generals, 8 colonels and lieutenant colonels, 6 majors, 18 captains, and 54 junior officers. American casualties in the battle are minuscule by comparison. Jackson himself is astounded. As he later recounts,
I never had so grand and awful an idea of the resurrection as when I saw more than 500 Britons emerging from the heaps of their dead comrades all over the plain, rising up and coming forward as prisoners.
On January 8, 1815, on the plains of Chalmette, Louisiana, outnumbered almost 2 to 1, Andrew Jackson and a hodgepodge army of Americans from varied class, ethnic, and racial backgrounds win one of the most lopsided victories in military history against the most powerful army in the world. It is a victory that will change the face of American politics and shape America's reputation as a force, finally, to be reckoned with. When the dawn breaks on the morning of January 9th, 1815, it is over. In the light of the British defeat, a truce is declared. Some of the Americans accept the grim task of helping the British with their dead and wounded. The bodies of General Pakenham and General Gibbs are eviscerated and preserved in rum barrels for transport back to England for burial. One British lieutenant describes the grim aftermath.
Of all the sights I have ever witnessed, that which met me there was beyond comparison the most shocking and most humiliating. Within the narrow compass of a few hundred yards were gathered together nearly 1,000 bodies, all of them arrayed in British uniforms.
British reaction upon discovering that their loss came nearly 2 weeks after peace had been declared can only be imagined. But on the American side, the news does not diminish the sense of triumph.
Many consider the battle as the ending battle of the War of 1812. The war has been over because we signed the Treaty of Ghent. This is not true. The treaty is not active until it's ratified by the Congress.
Had the Americans lost the Battle of New Orleans, there's a possible chance that the treaty might not have been ratified and the war might have continued. So the victory at New Orleans guaranteed the ratification of that signed treaty.
So technically, had the British been able to conquer New Orleans, as they had planned, thus placing a stranglehold on the American West, then they could have dictated peace terms because they held the key to the center of the continent.
For Americans, this final, decisive victory against 2 to 1 odds and against the army that bested Napoleon feeds a groundswell of new national pride.
What it did for a very divided United States at the end of that war is it helped bind it back together. Here, this tremendously diverse force of people who had never seen each other, who spoke at least 3 different languages, were brought together to stop the most powerful army in the world from capturing the city of New Orleans. It reaffirmed Americans' belief in themselves, in what the American experiment was to be. That it could develop into something very, very important.
Many of the Americans who fought at New Orleans are swept into positions of power, becoming governors, congressmen, legislators, and judges. Most of the American allies, the Creoles, frontiersmen, and free blacks, return to the routine of their daily lives. The Baratarians are granted a full pardon for their smuggling and other transgressions. Though their leader, Jean Lafitte, will forever be identified with the Battle of New Orleans, there are no witnesses who can place him there.
As far as Jean Lafitte himself being at Chalmette battlefield during the engagement we know as the Battle of New Orleans, there is very little proof that says he was there. There is mentions of his people, but no mention of Jean Lafitte. If this famous pirate was at the Battle of New Orleans, why doesn't anybody talk about him? Because he wasn't there.
Lafitte will continue his life as a pirate and spy and will be driven from New Orleans when he is caught with booty plundered from an American ship. But it is Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, who undergoes the greatest transformation. This poorly educated orphan of the Revolutionary War, known for his brawling and dueling and quick-tempered acts, soon becomes a national icon.
It catapults Andrew Jackson into the national spotlight. He becomes a national hero. In a war where the United States had so few heroes, Andrew Jackson became its greatest hero. It made him a national celebrity and eventually would propel him all the way to the White House and two of the most important terms of the presidency.
Jackson is once again elected as a United States Senator from Tennessee in 1823, and is finally elected President of the United States twice, in 1828 and 1832. When Jackson dies in 1845, he has seen the advent of the age of manifest destiny, which he helped to nurture.
What's important to remember here in the battle is the fact that it creates something for the Americans that they really haven't had, which is more of a national identity. The age of Jackson is born, the age of the common man, the man who can conquer all kinds of odds and go forth, tame the wilderness.
It is a victory that Jackson and the men who served there never forget. On the eve of the disbandment of Jackson's army, one artillery captain speaks for them all. Most people say that our American Republic was born the 4th day of July, 1776. This is not true. It was only begotten then. It was never confirmed until the 8th of January.